we'll do the live thing first. Like. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, feel free to hit us up on our Instagram or our Twitter at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast. You can reach out to us in our DMs there. If you ever wanted to support the podcast and send us depending on where you want, there's a couple different levels there, or ways you can support the podcast at patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. Wherever you're watching the podcast or listening, please give us a 5-star review if you can. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it really helps the podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and know when we drop our next videos. Like I said, if you ever tell your if you ever get a chance and you like the podcast, please share it with a friend. If you tell it to one friend, we can double the podcast overnight. So again, thank you so much for listening. Today I'm really excited. I'm really, been looking forward to doing this topic for a while, and I just finished watching one of my favorite movies of all time, not only just documentaries, but the documentary Sound City by Dave Grohl. It's actually Dave Grohl's first movie. Really, really interesting. I got into it, so it came out in around 2011, and I got super into it, like, not only because it's Dave Grohl and I really like the Foo Fighters and Nirvana, of course, and everything that he kind of does, but after I watched it, I was like, man, it's really beautiful to see a movie done by a musician, right? Because, you usually see, some musicians become actors, I guess, or even artists in other ways. Musicians become visual artists or sculptors, or whatever they do, they find other ways to kind of, authors and poets and stuff find other ways to kind of like express themselves, so to speak. But you don't really see them get too much behind the camera and really like put together a full movie, and it's really cool that Dave did this. And Sound City is actually a recording studio in LA, in Van Nuys, opened in 1969 by Joe Gottfried and Keith Olsen. Keith Olsen was the head engineer there at the time. And again, it's a really interesting place because so many musicians went there, and they recorded so many amazing albums out of this place. And it just makes sense to do a documentary about it. I think Dave gives a really, really interesting feel to the documentary. It's basically a love story about Sound City. And basically the reason why Dave Grohl is even involved with this whole thing is that's where Nirvana actually recorded Nevermind. So that's what, it's a really special place to Dave, because Nevermind, the album, was Nirvana's kind of like big break, and it kind of made them the biggest band in the world for a few years there. The way the movie kind of starts, it's really interesting. It's kind of a cool intro with anecdotes about touring, and this is kind of one of those bits where I was mentioning it's really interesting seeing a musician do a documentary like this, because documentary filmmakers can capture a lot of information, obviously, that comes from if they make their own documentary and they're interviewing musicians and stuff. But if they're not necessarily asking the right questions, you don't always get the right answers. But with Dave Grohl being a musician, he kind of his input into the movie and his narration at certain points, what he was able to add to the movie and to the context and just what's being presented was really cool. So, like I said, there was a bunch of anecdotes in this opening kind of sequence in the documentary, and one of the cool quotes from Dave. He says, when you're young, you're not afraid of what comes next. You're excited by it. And I always thought that's really cool, especially like thinking about being a young musician or for anybody out there who's just starting in something, and, you're things may be daunting, or when you look back at things like even like going to university and things like that, like, you're so excited by it, even though it's such a big thing. Now, as you get older, and as I get older myself, like I start to feel like big changes, obviously, with big changes come big changes. So, that can be really, really daunting, and the unknown out there can be frightening. But, that's why it's really, really amazing seeing young artists and young bands get out there. Another thing Dave said was, talking about him and Nirvana, we were driving a van that could break down at any moment, going on tours that could be canceled at any moment, and playing music with people who could disappear at any moment. And obviously super poignant, from start to finish there, driving in a van that could break down at any moment. That's, such a great commentary on what bands do just to get by, and just the corners you have to cut, and the things you have to live with just to friggin' get from point A to B. Tours and dealing with the music industry that you never know what's going to happen. And then obviously playing with people that could disappear at any moment. Obviously Dave's probably alluding to Kurt, but, it also alludes to, band members that not only that pass away, but, leave, and bands break up and things change, and, you never know what can happen. Getting back to Sound City, the record studio itself, the building was a little dumpy in the 80s and 90s. It kind of never really changed from it started in 1969, like I mentioned. It kind of never really changed its decor from the 70s. No one really cleaned it up. It kind of felt like you could do whatever you want there, treat it like shit, throw bottles everywhere, take a piss on the ground. Like, people wouldn't even give a shit. It was just seemed like a fucking dump. But out of this dump came fucking gold and platinum, technically. But some of the artists who recorded it at Sound City were Tom Petty, Fleetwood Mac, Rick Springfield, Neil Young, Cheap Trick, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Pat Benatar, Kansas, Guns N' Roses, Nine Inch Nails, Nirvana, Foreigner, Slayer, Rat, Santana, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Metallica, REO Speedwagon, Michael McDonald, Buckingham Nicks, BTO, Barry Manilow, Grateful Dead, Slipknot, Dio, Masters of Reality, Frank Black, Caius, Weezer, Rage Against the Machine. The list goes on, but just those bands there, like, that's powerhouse, amazing. So a little bit more about the history of the recording studio. Tom Skeeter became a partner with Joe Gottfried and wanted to get into the music industry in around 1970. So a year after Joe Gottfried kind of started the place, and Tom's whole idea was to start a record company. That was his whole idea of getting into the music industry. And Joe Gottfried was really the heart and soul of Sound City, but Tom Skeeter was kind of more the business guy. And they realized to get the best artists, you got to have the best equipment. So at this point, like I mentioned, Keith Olsen was the head engineer. And at this point is when the Neve Console comes in. So the Neve Console, anyone who doesn't know what a recording console is, it's basically the center of the spaceship. If you're going to fly to Mars, you basically need all the controls at your fingertips. So every mic in the studio, every instrument is routed into the board, where you can add the EQ, basically like your stereo with bass, middle, and treble. You can basically do that to every single instrument, add different effects, and then that signal is fed into the recorder, whatever type of recorder it is. This specific console, the Neve Console, was engineered by Rupert Neve, who's basically a genius engineer. And he He built it to custom specs by Keith Olsen. There's only 4 of them in the world, and this is the only one that was made custom to Keith Olsen specs. And Neve still makes great products today, but again, this board was something really special. It's really cool if you watch the documentary to see the artist kind of talk about it, and it just seemed like there's something magic that kind of happened with this board, and you can tell at one point Dave is interviewing Rupert Neve, and there's just something really, like, you can tell that Rupert is just talking about really, really specific, highly technical things, and it's just going right over Dave's head, and Dave's just going, I don't know what the hell's going on, man, but I like it. But again, you can tell listening to Rupert Neve, and he's talking about how just the interactions of the electricity running through certain materials in the core, like just stuff that's like way out of there, that he actually took into account all this stuff when he's building this thing. So it's really interesting. The recording process, I'll get into it a little bit later too, but the recording process is such an interesting part of making music because it's kind of where technology does meet art, right? You know, talk about paintbrushes, or even talk about like photography, let's say, and the advancements in lenses and things that you can do now with photography is kind of akin to what you can do with music. You know, technology's gotten you to different places. But you know, that at that moment in the studio is kind of where, you know, the rubber meets the road essentially. And you're using that technology to its utmost, trying to capture the art, which is basically your own creativity, and trying to capture that on tape, on record, whatever you want to say. The other cool thing about this board, obviously, is that it's analog. And the big thing about analog, and I'll get into that a little bit later too, analog sound is basically the natural sound. It's basically sound that is being created kind of in reality, like digital, like if there's like a digital realm, so where, you know, whatever the internet exists, or like computers, or like that whole realm, if that's fake, digital is fake, analog is real. Again, it's hard to say because it's all made by electronics, but analog electronics are pretty old school, and essentially the sound that comes right off your guitar, or when I snap my finger like this, my voice, is analog sound. And if you can imagine sound as a wave, it's a sine wave, it's complete, it's a nice smooth wave, where, like I said, I'll get into this in a minute, digital sound is kind of missing some components. So when Tom Skeeter actually went and bought the Neve console after Keith ordered everything, it came out to $76,000 when it was purchased in 1970-ish. Just some perspective, Tom bought a house for $36,000 that year. $36,000 for a house, by the way, people. Like, holy shit. Let me go to Toluca Lake, or wherever the fuck he's from. But yeah, 76 grand. So Tom always knew if things really went belly up, he could always sell the Neve console. But again, it shows you how serious these guys were. And the first track ever recorded on the Neve console was Crying in the Night by Buckingham Nicks. Tremendous song. Go check it out if you've never heard it. Really, really good track. And it's funny because that track being cut on that board is actually what became Fleetwood Mac. So Mick Fleetwood happened to be shopping studios around town, and he stopped into Sound City, and Keith Olsen was just kind of showing him what the sound is like and what he can do, and he pulled up the song Frozen Love, which is also a great song from the Buckingham Nicks album. And that's where Mick first heard Lindsey Buckingham play guitar. Lindsey happened to be in the studio at the time, and Lindsey and Mick Fleetwood met for the first time in Sound City. And after Peter Green left Fleetwood Mac, he asked Keith about Lindsey, and Lindsey said, "For sure, I'd love to be in the band. You just have to take my girlfriend with you." And that's how Stevie got into, and the rest is history. Fleetwood Mac was born. And it basically all was because of the drum sound. Mick fell in love with how the drums, you know, There's something about the drum sound at Sound City. There's something that it's the Neve board, it's the room, it's just there's some magic that happens. And basically the best way to choose a studio, according to Rick Rubin, is by blind testing drums. Guitar and bass, they basically can change in every room you're in. You can use effects, especially bass, but like even electric or acoustic guitar, you can use effects and you can kind of figure things out. But drums, very, very differently, very, very change. They're very different from room to room. And there's something really weird about the Sound City room, the Sound City drum room, because it's basically a big square room. It's not supposed to be a good drum room, but for whatever reason, and basically Keith Olsen and everyone else just thinks it's pure luck, that it just has this beautiful sound. And essentially what it comes down to is basically the space between the notes. And it's just the way the drums decay, and it's just a really, really interesting sound, and it's all built into that room. And that's the other thing, is that wherever you're recording, there's something special. And the area or the environment, or there's something about whatever that is, that just being in a certain place can inspire you to do different things. And let alone the inspiration from the area, but that can also add to the sound, the environment. Led Zeppelin was famous for recording, John Bonham recorded drums for When the Levee Breaks in this big Headley Grange, like this big, huge, towering staircase, and it gave this crazy headroom effect to the drums. Again, all that magic is what you're trying to capture when you're in the studio. And basically after the success at Sound City, of the Fleetwood Mac albums, Sound City was then able to start booking bigger artists. Santana came in, the Grateful Dead came in, and it actually attracted, like I said, it kept attracting new artists. And the first time Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers ever jammed for the first time was at Sound City. And then when they went to record Damn the Torpedoes, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' first album, they hired Jimmy Iovine. Jimmy Iovine basically runs the music industry these days. There's a great documentary called Defiant Ones, which talks about him and Dr. Dre's relationship, which is super interesting. Maybe I'll do another podcast about that. But one of the coolest things when Tom Petty was talking about his recording process with Jimmy Iovine and what they did at Sound City is they really touch on the recording process. And it made me think a lot about the recording process, right? It's like catching lightning in a bottle. And like I mentioned before, it's really where that's where you're finally preserving the music. Music is an interesting art form because it's ethereal. It doesn't really last. It's live music. It just kind of goes. And even when you're listening to something, it kind of just goes by. But the only way you're preserving music now is recording it. And that's becomes your canvas. That becomes, where you finally say, okay, this song is done. Let's fucking put it on wax. Let's make it real. And it's a really daunting process, right? Sometimes you're trying to go for greatness, and if you fall short of it, you have to live with that. And again, at the end of the day, it's about capturing the interplay between people. Music isn't necessarily supposed to be perfect, and it's really supposed to come from the soul. And putting yourself in a situation where you're like, okay, I got to play this right. I can't, make any mistakes and play the wrong notes. But I also have to put my heart and soul into this, but yet there's a bunch of people watching. Whether you're cutting the track alone or even playing with the whole band and doing a live cut, you still have to do it in front of people and it's for real this time, especially if you're working with like a famous producer or something. You feel that pressure. You feel the pressure maybe of a recording studio on you that's saying, hey, you have to do this, you have to do it really well. And it's like I said, it becomes almost a whole other art form. And I think, you know, the recording, the more you get into the recording process and the more you learn different things, you can find whatever works best for you. But there's so many different approaches. And even still, like you can do 150 takes of a song and just keep doing it. And then all of a sudden it becomes second nature. And then all of a sudden all these brand new things start coming out. Like there's so many approaches where all of a sudden you're doing 150 takes of a song, and then maybe another song you get it done in 1 or 2 takes. Like there also becomes so much preparation and things that go into the songs and the band before anything even happens. You know, a lot of bands' best album is their first album because essentially, depending on when they recorded it, they spent their whole lives up to that point working on those songs. And then all of a sudden you record it, it's out, it's great. And then within the next year or two, you have to come up with a whole new album and you're going, holy shit, how am I supposed to top all this? I spent 25, 30 years writing these other songs. Now I only have 2 or 1 or 6 months or whatever. So again, the recording process is a really, really interesting thing, and not every band can hack it, and it can become difficult, but it's also super fun, and you know, you get to really lay into the music, and you can do things that you could never do live on stage, and you're able to manipulate the sound and go in there and add different effects and add different instruments and play different things and listen to it over. And there's nothing better than sitting in the studio and listening to that sound that comes right off the board, right into the speakers. It sounds so real. It sounds so pure. And even though it might be you, it's still so cool to really dive into that side of things. It really lets you, again, sculpt and mold your sound as much as you can. Another really cool thing that Sound City actually seemed to do is redefine the role of a producer. So producer used to kind of mean someone who just kind of kept things on track, budget, schedule, etc. But what Sound City started to do is making the producer someone who works with the songs, someone who can say, this could be better, that could be great, why isn't this more like that? You know, and try and get the most out of the musicians, which takes a lot, right? Because like, especially if you're working with huge stars, you have to have some balls to be like, this sucks, why isn't this like that? And it's an interesting interplay you have with the producer because, you know, I obviously like to, you know, make sports analogies when I'm talking about music because I think they're so interesting and they're so close. But when you're a band and you're like a team, sometimes you have a captain, but sometimes you don't even have a captain. And it's just like 5 friggin' players out there, or 4 or 6 or 10 or whatever, however many are in the band. You're just a bunch of players out there doing your thing. You're working together as a team, but sometimes the guidance isn't always there, and you're kind of going with the flow a little bit more. A producer kind of is a little bit more like your coach, where it's going to be someone who is able to guide you a little bit more, but it's not someone who can go and do it for you. And I think that's one of the really hard things about being a producer, and probably the fine line you have to walk, is that you don't want to overstep and do so much that you're now the band doesn't sound like the band anymore. And then you know, Keith Olsen said, basically the producer is the vehicle to get the artist's creativity on the table in a way that's accessible to their audience, and then essentially convince the audience that the producer had nothing to do with it. And that's like the perfect producer. Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age is in the documentary, and he said basically producers put a cake dish over the bat phone, which I always thought was a really interesting analogy. And again, I think he means, you know, they put that protective layer over your idea. And the most important thing and how you want to give it out to people, they allow you to present it in a way that's accessible, but in a protected way. Anyway, it's an interesting analogy. Maybe it doesn't make sense when you unpack it, but really cool. And like I said, that interplay with the producer can go both ways, right? Sometimes you don't agree with the producer and there's friction and they want to push their idea as much as they can, and then all of a sudden it doesn't sound like you anymore, and you're like, I don't even know what we wrote here, and this is crazy, and it gets out of hand. So again, that interplay with the producer is really, really special, and it takes a really special person as a producer to work with these bands and really kind of make beautiful music, but allow the artist to do that. So in the kind of during the 80s, when scientists, people out there developed digital sound and CDs, it really changed the music industry massively. Huge, not only the technology of digital sound, but CDs, it was a whole new way of selling, and people were turning over their whole vinyl albums and just buying all these CDs. And it really, really affected Sound City. Like I mentioned before with analog sound, the difference between analog and digital is basically digital is kind of a segmented version of analog. Like I mentioned, analog is that smooth wave, that full curve, where digital sound is kind of, like I said, a series of dots. It's segmented. It's like a series of beeps in tones that are moving so fast, kind of like a moving picture. It's moving so fast that we perceive it as music, and it's going along. So essentially what that means is that there's pieces of the sound missing. You're not getting that full signal that would come from normal music. And most of the time we don't really notice. There's ways to kind of mess with the sound so you don't really notice, or your headphones aren't that great. But when you really compare the two, like when you're listening to a vinyl record versus like an MP3 off Spotify, there is a major difference. So a lot of people weren't necessarily down with the changes, but then again, a lot of people were, because it made the manipulation of sound a lot easier. It basically allowed you to, do what I do. Recording this right now, I'm recording this in the digital domain. This is a digital recording going through an interface, going onto my computer, let alone the video part, but just the sound part alone is completely digital. I can go in there, I can edit things really easily, where back in the day you had to actually get a tape, you actually had to cut the tape physically, throw it out, tape it back together, and there's your cut. Now literally you can go in with your computer, done, cut. So it made things a lot easier, but did it make things a lot better? I guess that's debatable. Like I mentioned, Sound City really couldn't keep up with the times. Everyone was moving towards digital, and Sound City just didn't want to update their equipment. There was also some trouble with talent coordination. Again, they were a record company, so they're trying to get big record deals with these bands, and sometimes trying to pursue them became expensive, and not every time things worked out. So they were kind of in dire straits, and basically by the late 80s, Sound City was dead. It wasn't completely closed down, but no one was really coming out. But in early 1991, 3 dudes from Aberdeen, Washington, decided to roll down to Van Nuys and record one of the most world-altering, music industry-changing albums, Nevermind. So the boys from Nirvana rolled in, and they basically completely saved Sound City. The success of Nevermind brought brand new artists from all over. Everyone was wondering where this album was done, where these drums came from. Rage Against the Machine chose Sound City again because Nevermind was recorded there. Brad Wilk, the drummer, was stoked to record there. They actually did most of their recording like live from the floor, which I thought was super cool. Shout out Julian and Sam. The boys were just at Rage Against the Machine. Heard the show was amazing. And again, like I said, Sound City was sticking with that analog equipment, sticking with that analog sound. And people who actually wanted that analog and simple sound were drawn to the studio. So those people started, Frank Black from the Pixies and, people like Queens of the Stone Age and, these newer kind of alternative bands were starting to come to Sound City because, again, they wanted to record on tape. And like I mentioned before, not only is it hard to make edits, but because it's so hard to make edits, when you are recording on tape, the performance has to be amazing. And that really changes how the music actually is, right? There's only so many things you can do after it's actually on tape. So when you know that and you're playing, you're going to play to your fucking best because you're going, we only have so much tape and I can't just go in there like with Pro Tools or DAW, whatever you're using, Logic, and go in there and fix the note because this is for real. So what that does is makes you play better. And even if you do make mistakes, sometimes that's captured on tape and that makes it sound real. Again, on the other side, Pro Tools and things like that and GarageBand. And, if anyone has a Mac right now, you can open up your computer and record a song basically at the same fidelity and same, quality that, Billie Eilish or someone, any other top 40 artist does right now. Basically, they just do all their recording on a laptop. It's obviously enabled some people access to the music industry, but some people think that maybe these people haven't earned it in a way. I don't know. Maybe it's hard when essentially what they're saying is people who could be good enough to be recorded on this tape should be out there. But I guess that's something, but at the same time, because this technology is out there, why not? It is so much easier. Just because it's easier technology doesn't mean that you can't still get a great performance out of someone, right? So it's hard to say. It's debatable for sure. 9 Inch Nails, for instance, use Pro Tools as an instrument itself, right? So you can look at it like, again, it's something that, yes, it's going away from tradition, but it's also going in the direction of making things easier, that maybe you can use some of those old ways and bring them into the new world. Interesting. Eventually, sadly, for Sound City, digital recording took over, and most large studios have gone out of business. One of the best lines from the documentary, there's no music, said by Joshua Home, the boy from Queens of the Stone Age. He says, there's no music store, there's no bookstore, and there's no Sound City. And I always thought that's such a poignant line because, again, Amazon took it all over. Netflix took over. And fucking Logic or whatever, Pro Tools took over recording studios. Now, don't get me wrong, it used to cost $400,000 to record an album. So, again, this is the weird thing. Is it better now? Has there been better music? Who knows, right? Definitely analog sound is the way to go, though. And in 2011, Dave actually bought that Neve console from Sound City, revived the studio again. Dave Grohl comes to the rescue again, and he put it in his home studio. So Dave has an amazing studio, obviously, in his house, which he's multimillionaire, so it's a sweet ass house. And he brought the Neve console home, and he actually invited a bunch of artists that had recorded on the Neve console and recorded at Sound City to lay down some new tracks. And it's a really, really wicked album. It's called Reel to Reel, REAL to REEL, which I thought is clever. And it features the likes of Stevie Nicks, Robert Levon Bean from Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, Chris Goss from Caius, Taylor Hawkins, R.I.P., Jim Keltner, Paul McCartney, Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick, Chris Novoselic, Trent Reznor, Patch Smear, Corey Taylor from Slipknot, Lee Ving, Brad Wilk, Josh Homme. Tremendous album, super cool. Again, a really cool look. Again, even more so into the recording process. I have the record on vinyl. It's tremendous. Go listen to it. It's got some great songs on it. One of my favorite songs of all time called "If I Were Me." It's Dave Grohl doing his thing. It's fucking a great song. I guess it's basically by the Foo Fighters, but it's not really. So go check that out. But in conclusion, I kind of touched on it a few times, and it's interesting with the advances in technology that we want to be at the curve. We want to push things forward, and we want to drive innovation. We want to do new things, but we don't want to destroy tradition. And I think looking back, and especially documentaries like this, looking back and understanding that there's certain pieces of technology or certain pieces of equipment or buildings or places that are special. There's something that resides in there that you can't quite put into words. And if we just go around fucking mowing shit down because it's old, destroying old buildings, moving on with new technologies, destroying old ways of living. If we just go and do that because something's new and throw that thing away for good, we're only bound to repeat our mistakes, right? Because even though, there's certain things we should never ever repeat and never ever do in history, if we completely throw out everything, we're going to lose some of that magic that might come from certain technologies or certain traditions that are real. And I think, and I mentioned on this podcast before, I think we're moving away from tradition as a society, and we're saying tradition doesn't matter anymore, and we're going into these whole new ways of living. And I don't want this to come from this to sound like some weird tirade about, the times are changing and blah, blah, blah. All I'm saying is that as human beings, the way we preserve ancient knowledge and knowledge that makes sense, that we don't have to keep figuring out every year, if we can pass on that knowledge from year to year in traditions like how you record music, how you play music together, how you create art together, how you make science and architecture, and as we work together as a people, and if you can tap into that team aspect. And again, we as a people are this giant team. And like I said, I always liken sport and music, because again, a band is a team that's working together, and you're capturing this interplay between people and between souls and between creative minds. And if you can do that in a real way and capture it on analog sound and listen to it and hear it on the record and be like, wow, this is what it sounds like when two people are understanding each other in the most utmost way. They're working together on that perfect level. They're in each other's minds. If we can all work together and understand we can get on people's level, I think it'll just be a better place. I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening. Again, wherever you're watching, please give us a 5-star review if you like to listen to the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications when a new video drops. If you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, it is up on our DMs on Twitter or Instagram at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast. If you ever wanted to support the podcast, check out our Patreon. Patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. There's a few different levels there. You can donate to us to keep the lights on, so to speak. And again, thank you so much for listening. Go check out this documentary, Sound City. It's amazing. Keep tradition alive, everybody. Love y'all. Peace.